This is a story about a girl who is forced to learn the lessons of God while imprisoned on earth. She came to her grandmother who was dying, but she didn't feel sad about it, because all people die someday. Then she remembered who she was a long time ago. She came into the world and was the first person to come down to earth. She received the love of other people because she was very beautiful. But she was only good at receiving love, not sharing it. There came a time when people even started to fight and wage wars for her. And then, unable to stand this lawlessness, the spirit came down to earth and reprimanded the girl, because she didn't see the problem of only receiving universal recognition. In order to punish her, he took the trunk where she put all her love. No matter how much the protagonist begged for the trunk to be returned to her, it didn't work. They fought all night, and in the morning, as the sun rose, the spirit flew away. He wanted the girl to realize her own mistakes and find the answers to his questions. No matter how long she lived, she never found an answer. And now eternal life was her curse, and she couldn't fix it. During this time, she had already changed her body many times, gotten a new name, a completely different history and place of residence. And she wanted it all to stop. Then, noticing her granddaughter's thoughtfulness, her grandmother told her that she had found some answers to some questions. But unfortunately, as soon as the woman started talking, she died. A frightened child tried to bring her back to her senses, but nothing worked. She didn't know what to do because she was trapped in that body again. Decades later, the girl died, realizing she'd wasted her life again. No matter how many times she was reborn, she could never find out the answer to her question, although she wondered who she would become in her next life. When the protagonist opened her eyes, she heard her voice, realizing that she was a baby, and saw the maids who addressed her as a princess. This surprised the protagonist, because usually if in the past life she was rich, then in the next life became poor and vice versa. But this time, it turned out quite different. But it did not matter, because having a rich life, the heroine will be easier to find answers to the questions of the spirit. But suddenly she heard the footsteps of a man coming. The maids immediately began to whisper about the arrival of the emperor. The man wanted to see his daughter. The protagonist was clearly not happy to see him. But suddenly the man grabbed his daughter and began to admire the little princess, delighted at how beautiful Darjeelina was. It pleased him that his daughter was so much like him. Darjeelina tried her best to restrain her newfound father, but she could not do anything. And it became obvious that even in this life, she would not be able to achieve anything. In addition, this man was well known to her. The protagonist remembered her past life as she sat talking to her grandmother. The woman persuaded her granddaughter to take the throne, but the protagonist was strongly against it because she was not interested in power. But the woman believed that one day the child will still accept her proposal. Despite all her refusals, when the time came, then, as the past queen wanted, Darjeelina took the throne after her death, because in her suicide note, she wrote that it was the protagonist should take her place. The peculiarity of the past queen was that she was mostly at war while her friends were busy with their personal lives. So she never had a soulmate or a child. Everyone asked her to marry, but she refused every time. And so she refused 5 people before she became queen. And when she got power, she demoted people, so she never had an heir to the throne. But she liked the main character. She saw her as her granddaughter and thought she was smart beyond her years. Despite the fact that the girl really wanted to run away, she still accepted her new destiny, becoming queen. It seemed to her that she would be surrounded by smart people, but everything turned out to be even. At some point, the protagonist was very tired of dealing with state affairs, but she understood that in this case against her country may start a war with neighboring states. This idea is deep in the girl's head, so she decided to also become a conqueror and dispel her boredom. She was able to conquer several territories and continued to expand her state until it became an entire empire. She lived her whole life for her country, so when she was dying, she decided to give the young duke her throne, after which she died, realizing that she had never been able to find the answers to the questions that had troubled her all her life. But fate really messed with her. She was born into an imperial family and became heir to the throne. What upset her the most was that the emperor she had given power to in her past life was her father. Darjeelina continued to grow up, but she could not find answers to her questions because of her small age. Her father, who loved her madly, was always very protective of her, which the girl did not like. But one day, a countess arrived to visit them in the imperial palace, along with her young children. They took turns introducing themselves to the protagonist. The first of them was Martha Ronov, but the protagonist didn't like this girl because of her unusual name. Next was the eldest son, his name was Carlisle. And last was the little boy in the maid's arms, his name was Barry. Joseph was glad to see the countess and her children arrive, and hoped that their children would become friends. But despite all her attempts, the princess could not make friends with the children, because their mental ages were on different levels. The only one who still attracted her attention was the countess's eldest son, because he behaved in a very mature way, despite the fact that he was young. The protagonist also tried to use her acquaintance with these children to unravel her curse. But despite the story told, the children did not know the answer to this question and assumed very naive answers. It was expected, so Darjeelina was not very upset, but a boy who suddenly turned to her, seeing her fleeting sadness, decided to treat the princess with sweets. The main character felt very tired, because the children were too young for her not to understand such too mature behavior of the princess, but did not argue with her. As the girl fell asleep, she hoped that tomorrow she would be able to rest and meditate quietly. But the next day, the children of the countess's family came to her again. All the time they were playing and having fun, while the protagonist was watching them and reading a book. But during the game, one of the children's wooden sword fell out, hitting the princess in the face. The guilty youngest child began to cry and apologize. Darjeelina knew it was not out of malice, so she began to calm the children and offered to tell them something funny. She told them the story of the Empress, the only girl who could easily deal with her enemies. This ruler was so majestic that when she wanted new territories, their rulers would surrender without a fight and fall on their knees, begging for her favor. While the girl was recounting an episode from her past life of campaigning, she demonstrated this by riding a wooden horse, from which she fell right in front of her father. Initially, the emperor calmed everyone present, explaining that the fall of children is the norm, which should not panic. But immediately after these words, he ran to his daughter and, lifting her in his arms, tried to understand whether she was all right and whether she was not badly hurt. After that, he began to kiss the girl where she had hurt herself. Everyone understood how loving a father Joseph was, for he cried tears of happiness when he saw that his daughter looked straight into his eyes. The maid and the knight thought this moment very sweet, as did the other children, but Darjeelina saw nothing good in it. The protagonist remembered Joseph very well from when he was just an ordinary duke. He was a very trustworthy young man, but now it was unclear where the general she knew had gone. When Joseph saw Darjeelina's drawings which she was making with the other children, he immediately began to admire her, seeing in her a future artist, and the image of this loving father clearly did not fit with what the protagonist remembered in the old days. The only reason the protagonist continued to tolerate Joseph was because he was an incredibly handsome young man, and she had always liked him. But suddenly, they were disturbed by the emperor's aide, who reported the appearance of an appeal from the lord of the conquered lands. The matter was urgent, so the emperor immediately left to deal with the problem. Darjeeling was pleased that Joseph was still working and not just running after his daughter. The girl also remembered her past, when she was a beggar and asked other people for some money for food, but he was not in as dire a situation as the protagonist. So his advice seemed silly to her. But now, thinking about it, she realized that his words were much more logical than they initially seemed. But as soon as she was distracted by the children playing, she saw a bright light in the window behind them, blinding her. Fearing that the spirit might be seen, Darjeelina immediately grabbed it and hid it behind her back so that the other children wouldn't see it. Later, they had a serious conversation. The spirit was still not going to forgive the girl and let her go back to her old life. As it turned out, he was interested in the changes in the girl's life because she had many friends. But Darjeeling did not want to admit that these constantly screaming and crying children are her friends. Despite the protagonist's reluctance, the spirit still suggested that she team up with these children to find her own answers. Darjeelina didn't know if she wanted to keep searching for them, for no matter how much life she lived, it was all futile. So it seemed to her that God had given up on her. But instead of being discouraged, the spirit suggested that she just continue her work and search for answers. But Darjeelina doubted she could do that, so she asked for some clue. But the spirit refused, for the girl had to realize the answer on her own to complete her endless life. Although he thought the question was too difficult, but he hoped she could handle it. Finally, taking all the cookies with him, the spirit flew away, and the young count wanted to sit and talk to the princess. He saw the girl's depression and wanted to help her. While the princess was looking at him, thinking about the similarity of the child's character to Joseph's, the boy was embarrassed, thinking he was too presumptuous. Afterward, they just continued to talk quietly, discussing the usual mundane subjects. But the little children kept them busy by distracting them with their talk. They also noticed the princess's uneasiness and wanted, like real detectives, to find the cause of her uneasiness and eliminate the problem. Looking at these children, Darjeelina was convinced that she would surely die if she continued to be in their company. For some time, the children ran merrily until they were tired, for the library was too far away. Then the maids came up and wanted to help the princess to get to the library, but she asked to save the children who were suffocating. As soon as they reached the library, they all scattered happily near the shelves to look around. Darjeelina realized that she would not find any answers here. As empress in her previous life, she had searched the library and the whole place. Suddenly, Martha saw a beautiful painting that depicted a duel between an angel and a demon. She liked the painting very much, but the children began to argue about who was the antagonist in the painting. The children's quarrel escalated to insults and almost got into a fight. The girl thought the angel was bad for attacking demons. While they were arguing, Darjeelina heard many interesting thoughts from the child about the researcher Rolf de Janiat. She was surprised, for a child of her age could hardly know about such books. The children continued to argue until the older brother calmed the two down and asked them to be quieter in the library. Despite their reluctance, the children apologized to each other and soon made up. While Darjeelina was sitting in the library looking at the shelves, the children wanted to read one of the books about 101 ways to make their loved one confess their love. The kids were eager to hear what it was all about. The children listened very attentively all the time while their brother was reading. But as soon as the book was over, they immediately attacked their brother with questions about his personal life and whether he had ever kissed anyone. Such questions very embarrassed the boy, and then the main character realized that despite his adult behavior, he was still a child. But because of the book, she remembered the events of her past life as empress. Then the ministers kept trying to marry her off. She couldn't even remember the names of all the men who wanted to be her husbands and swore their love to her. Many aristocrats tried to get close to the empress in order to introduce her to their sons, and the one thing they all had in common was that they never did what the protagonist really wanted. But she couldn't blame them, since marriage was a duty of the members of the imperial family. Darjeelina was upset that such a life had to happen again. Although even before, when she was an ordinary girl, she had been forced to marry. But then she had the right to protest. And since she was a princess in this life, she would have to fight people about her marriage again. Carlyle, who noticed this, smiled at the princess, and then carefully covered her to keep her warm. While the girl slept, she dreamed about the time when she started the war, and it was a happy dream. She remembered talking to her advisor about the temple that had been taken away from her recently. Now the temple didn't belong to her, so she couldn't ask for information from it. The temple did not want to cooperate with them because it was free. This made the protagonist very angry, and she demanded to find a solution, but everything that could be done from a political point of view has already been done. The temple also insisted on being an independent organization, not wanting to satisfy the queen's request, and forcing them into submission could block the Western Sea route to which their organization belonged. Despite all her help, the counselor didn't understand their queen's interest in this temple and their records. But the queen was reminded of a prophet who had come recently. The prophet said that she would be able to find answers where everything had been taken from her, and the only thing that had been taken from the protagonist was the temple. The assistant tried to explain that there were other robberies as well, but the queen only started getting angry and talking about how she wanted to take everything she needed from the temple. The assistant tried to convince the queen that she shouldn't act so harshly. She was worried that the girl would want to start another war again, and she would have to stop the queen. Trying to find a more peaceful solution, Darjeelina wanted to remind the temple that fish had been stolen from their territory near the temple, and their fishermen had been killed. She wanted to use this to further the negotiations. But as it turned out, this problem was solved long ago. So the protagonist began to think about how she should take the temple back to her subordination. The assistant tried to convince the ruler that another war would not bring any benefit, because they lost this temple during the last battle. But the conversation about the war instilled in the girl the belief in her victory. She wanted to feel this extreme again, so she asked to bring the general to her. Despite all the requests, the order was fulfilled, a plan was developed, and the battle began, in the end of which the protagonist won. But the temple she had captured was completely destroyed and would take a long time to rebuild, so she could not find the records she needed in the library. But suddenly, she heard some noise, and turning around, she noticed a boy who was picking up already used and unnecessary weapons, as well as the surviving decorations of the temple. The queen was surprised to see a child here, but she was distracted by the servants. As soon as she turned her back, the boy disappeared. The knights came to clarify the queen's next order to search the records. She gave them orders to rebuild the temple and to examine all the books that were there. While the rebuilding of the temple was going on and all the records were being collected, the heroine realized she hadn't found what she needed. So she thought hard about where the truth the spirit wanted her to hear was hidden. The spirit once gave her a clue that the knowledge she needed was in the human world, and it seemed to her that this was the place. But when she heard a noise, she went outside and saw that the knights had captured the same boy she had seen earlier near the ruins of the temple. The knights wanted to punish him for stealing. They explained that the boy had snuck in to steal potatoes, but in addition, he had taken not 1 or 2 potatoes, but a whole sack. Darjeelina looked at the heavy sack and was surprised that the boy was really going to carry it all away. She was interested in him, so she asked him to introduce himself. This child's name was Joseph. Looking him over carefully, the queen saw that the boy was quite well groomed, despite the fact that he was now covered in mud. So she asked him to introduce himself by his full name. The queen liked the fact that the child had hidden his true name from the beginning, for it indicated that he was clever. So she decided to take him in and give him some work. But despite all expectations, the boy did much better than was expected of him. Although after work he also ate very much, which surprised many adult knights. Over time, Joseph also began to develop an interest in fencing and would overhear the general talking about what techniques to hone and what advice he gave to the others. But usually he was often distracted by other knights, giving him extra work to do. After all his tasks were done, the boy would start fencing and try to do it with a stick, and he did quite well. But in one of these trainings, he was approached by the commander, who handed the child a sword and realized that Joseph really wanted to learn fencing. He appreciated his desire and appointed him a training session at 6 o'clock in the evening. In time, the boy cut his hair so that it would not interfere with his fighting and practiced very hard despite his losses. In one of these training battles, he was seen by the queen, who went for a walk. The commander sent the child to continue training on his own and explained to the queen that he was teaching Joseph to wield a sword because he saw in his eyes a desire. But the boy exceeded all expectations. The queen realized that they had brought this child with them for a reason. As time went on, the protagonist began to age, but all the while her faithful assistant remained by her side, following her wherever she went. She began to entrust him with important missions, and once asked him to stand in defense of the southern lands, and even allowed him to use any number of troops needed. She was proud to have such a duke by her side. But even though she was not involved in military affairs, she had many other state affairs to attend to. And as time went on, it seemed that her worries only increased. She spent hours sitting for papers and documents, because everywhere her permission was required, both for construction and for holding various festivals. In the end, from such a nightmare of paperwork, the protagonist finally woke up and saw that the children around her were already playing, folding origami paper ships. Then, looking at the most serious of the children, the protagonist realized that the boy was really very cute, despite the fact that he wanted to seem grown up. He even seemed to enjoy doing this hobby. The children started to ask the princess to fold origami with them, but to their horror, the princess failed. The ship looked too rough and broken, but the children still tried to comfort the princess, trying to explain that everything was not so bad. Then Cyril came to her aid and took her broken ship and started to explain how to fold it correctly, which also seemed very nice to the girl. After that, the children were tired and decided to go to the maids to feed them. And Carlisle, as a responsibility for them, started to collect all the scattered papers, and after that he wanted to join the others. He asked Darjeelina to do the same, but the girl refused, wanting to help her poor older brother. By chance, their hands touched during the cleaning, and then gently taking the princess's delicate hand, the boy was worried that she might hurt herself on the sharp edges of the paper. They finished cleaning together, and surprisingly, Carlisle did not throw away the damaged ship of the main character. So she decided to give him her origami, which he was very flattered by. After that, they went to the dining room together. But suddenly, a man came in and was interested in a book about 101 ways to declare love, and decided to take it away while no one was looking. Later, while dining with her father, the emperor, he introduced to his daughter the boy Sasha Vladimir, who was to help the protagonist with her studies. As an obedient child, Darjeelina agreed, although she saw no use in this boy and thought that future studies might be too tedious. As she continued to eat, the main character left potatoes on her plate. She didn't like them, but thinking back to little Joseph, she remembered the boy who tried to steal a sack of potatoes after eating potatoes throughout the war. Because of his love for potatoes, the loving father tried to feed his daughter. But when she refused to do so, his face became very sad, so the protagonist had no choice but to agree. Another reason Darjeelina listened to Joseph was that in her previous life, she behaved too mature for her age and was considered a witch and executed. But despite the fact that the protagonist tried to avoid these moments in every possible way, her father still considered the girl mature beyond her years and very talented. But it was time to deal with work issues, so before leaving, the father said goodbye to his daughter and ordered the new teacher of the princess to be more careful and do not offend his daughter, and then left. As soon as the door closed behind him, Sasha immediately addressed the princess by her name, which did not match her title, but justified her behavior by the fact that the emperor wanted them to become friends. Looking at Sasha, it seemed to the princess that they had seen each other before, though it struck her as odd, for this was too young a boy for her to have met him in a past life. Afterward, Sasha introduced himself again and told her that he belonged to the Vladimir clan. Darjeelina knew that in history this clan was known for its megalomania, but she didn't remember anyone with red hair from this family. The guy's job was to teach the princess everything she needed to know. She was a little surprised by this. Although she knew that it was her job to become the ruler of the country, she felt that the education her father was trying to give her too early was too rushed. Sasha was also interested in the countess's children, who were temporarily staying at the palace, so the princess asked the maids to bring them to the garden as soon as possible. When the time came for introductions, Sasha smilingly greeted all the children, introduced himself, and explained that he was the princess's teacher. But the children were not interested, and only made Carlisle a little wary. The twins asked the princess to play with them. Even though she didn't want to play hide and seek, she agreed. They were supposed to be looking for Sasha, so Carlisle helped the girl find a hiding place. Carlisle also explained that he also wanted to help the princess with her education, and he was willing to learn everything she needed to help her. Initially, the main character didn't give it much thought, thinking that the boy wanted to help her because he enjoyed teaching children. By this time, Sasha had already found the twins and went in search of Darjeelina, but finding her was much easier than she expected. So as soon as Sasha got closer, Darjeelina grabbed Carlisle's hand and they started to run away. Darjeelina wanted to run away so that they wouldn't be forced to play with the twins again. The others were worried about the princess's behavior, but didn't stop her, although the maids warned that she might fall. And in the end, they were right, because the princess overdid it and fell, pulling Carlisle with her. everyone around her immediately started looking at her worriedly, worried about how hard she had hit. She also learned from the knight that her father really wanted to meet her, so the princess explained to the other children that they had played enough for today. Although at the last moment, turning to Carlyle asked that he went with her for ointment, but he calmly explained that he was fine. And looking at his restraint, the protagonist realized that she would definitely make the boy her assistant in the future. Sasha also approached the princess, explaining that he had to go back to his father. Darjeelina had little interest in this, so she said goodbye to the young man. Looking after the princess, he was angry that everyone around him was so worried about some pathetic fall. In the palace, Darjeelina saw a portrait of herself from her past life. The knight began to praise the past empress, thinking she was a great ruler. While the knight was praising the past empress and telling the girl that she would one day take her place, a worried Joseph ran up, picked the girl up in his arms, and began to feel sorry for her. The man persuaded his daughter to go to treat her wounds with him, and Darjeelina had to calm him down, explaining that nothing terrible had happened to her, and it was only a couple of scratches. In the end, despite all the arguments, the man still persuaded his daughter to treat the wound, and she agreed, happy that her father at least did not think that she had a fracture. But suddenly in the corridor, the girl met Sasha next to a man. The princess assumed that it was Duke Vladimir. The duke greeted the emperor and explained that he wanted to return to his land to take care of the people. Sasha also smiled and thanked the emperor for the task entrusted to him, after which they discussed the preparation of the statue that Joseph had ordered and parted ways. But the moment the duke passed Darjeelina, she had a maddeningly strange feeling, as if she sensed the energy of death. The next day, the princess still remembered how she'd been treated all night, for the emperor had raised a panic. And the princess didn't want to go through that again, so she reassured Joseph that she was fine. She also noticed the jar of ointment that was used on her. It was obvious that it looked quite expensive. Just that moment, her healer told her that he used to treat the princess with ointment from dragon's breath, of which there were only 3 left in this world. A frightened Darjeelina knew that dragons had disappeared 500 years ago, and this thing was truly incredible. Joseph seemed like an idiot to her if he decided to use an ointment that could save a mortally ill person on an ordinary wound. But suddenly, a knight entered the room, informing the emperor that the alchemist had come to see him. Joseph asked to escort the alchemist to his study, whereupon Joseph hurriedly left, bidding his daughter farewell. The girl was still wondering why the alchemist was in the imperial palace. After all, he was a wanderer who didn't belong to any country. But her father didn't want to explain anything to her. The man also demanded that the princess's personal maids keep her away from the cabin, but the girl was not going to give in so easily. And no matter how much the maids distracted her and offered her various distinctions, she insisted on going for a walk in the garden. For next to this garden was her father's study. The maids were very anxious, but the princess was undeterred, though she was embarrassed by the girl's behavior, as if they were trying to hide something from her. In the end, they went to the garden, where the maids were preparing easels for the princess to paint and reminisced about their youth. They wished very much that when the princess grew up, the war would be over and the girl would always be safe. They remembered the first time they brought the princess to the palace, and that day, even the weather was not on their side. Everyone was ready to faint when they heard that the princess arrived at the palace with a high fever and drenched in rain. Joseph was then informed that the princess might not survive because it was too late to treat her. But still, the girl overcame the disease and grew up to be a calm and strong child. She was already 3 years old. Calmly sitting in the garden, the main character was drawing and finally finished her masterpiece. So providing it, the maid asked them to guess who was depicted in her drawing. The girls made completely different guesses, but the correct answer was that it was their Emperor Joseph. They talked a little more when another maid came to tell the princess that Joseph was expecting her. She did not know the reason for such a sudden meeting, but promised the emperor that she would bring the girl to the study as soon as possible. Joseph, when they brought her daughter, immediately began to embrace her, and then explained that he had prepared a gift for her, which he wanted to give her back in the days when the girl had just begun to walk. The girl saw a beautiful box in front of her, and her father explained that the gift he had prepared was made with the help of the alchemist, and Joseph had ordered it quite a long time ago, but all the preparations had just been finalized. The intrigued girl then took the toy out of the box. She was a little disappointed in the alchemical abilities of the man who had made it, for it looked completely unremarkable. But Joseph explained that the specialty of the toy would be that it would always be near the princess, for the toy had special powers. Despite looking like a plush duckling, Joseph really wanted to always be by his daughter's side in order to protect her. But sometimes he couldn't do it because of the huge amount of work, so he wanted the toy to be with her all the time. At this moment, the girl suddenly felt a kind of sadness, because she didn't think that she should worry about her safety at all, because even if she dies, she will be reborn. Joseph gave his daughter the powder and asked her to spray it over the toy and then give it a name, and then she would officially own it. Immediately after the work was done, the toy shone and made a sound characteristic of ducks. Then looking at it, Darjalina realized that something had changed in it, and the toy looked more like a real duck. As it turned out, Joseph had taken care of the defense system sewn into the toy, so it had a laser inside that could attack dangerous targets. But such things were too dangerous to use as a simple toy, so Joseph asked to use it in emergency situations. He also asked the alchemist to add his voice to the toy so his daughter would never miss him. Joseph really loved his daughter a lot, and really wanted her to grow up safe, and hoped that Darjalina liked this little gift. Darjalina realized that if she had had this toy in her past lives, she would have handled it much better. Then she decided to thank her father, thinking he deserved her praise. So she gave him the drawing, which she thought would be worth a fortune. Her father was very happy with the gift and wanted to meet his daughter again later for dinner. So he asked the servants to prepare everything and left to continue his work. The princess was tired of the day and decided to go to her room, and was disappointed that her childish body was getting tired so quickly. In her previous life, when assassins came to her, she could easily hear them and never needed anyone's help. But now she has to defend herself with the help of a toy until she grows up. The protagonist was wondering how she would live this life and how long she would live, and if she would be able to find answers to her questions. Time passed, and the emperor was finishing all his business when he was reminded about the dinner with the princess. Then the man immediately began to hurry in order not to be late for the princess. The knight went to the princess to remind her about the dinner, but when he got closer, he heard a strange sound coming from her room that sounded like crackling. The room was soon filled with the screams of the servants. There was no sign of intrusion outside the room, so they immediately went inside to see what had happened. And there they saw that the whole room was filled with smoke. The knight immediately opened the windows to ventilate the room and felt the terrible smell of Gary. At that time, the princess's toy with its laser attacked an insect that accidentally flew into the room and could not stop, no matter how the girl tried. However, with the arrival of the knights, the toy stopped firing its laser, and the frightened knight, having made sure that the princess was safe, ordered the others to search the room. He did not yet understand what had happened and thought that some mercenary had snuck into it. The protagonist still couldn't believe that a mosquito had flown into her room, but what seemed more unbelievable was that the duck had automatically decided to kill it. Despite how long the protagonist had lived, she had never seen a mosquito perceived as a killer, but she had become convinced of the power of this toy, and it was obvious that it had been made by the great alchemist. The worried knight decided to find and exterminate the insects as soon as possible, so that situations like this would not happen again, and sent the other knights to report to the emperor. Darjalina realized that Joseph was most likely paying the price by learning what had happened. Because of her excitement since she opened her eyes, the man had never left her alone, and it was exhausting for her to think about it. But at that moment, a very scared emperor burst into the princess's room, screaming her name and trying to find her. Looking around, he saw his daughter, but the protagonist was worried that her father was angry because of the ruined room. But instead, he grabbed his daughter in his arms and began to explain how much he was worried about her. He then promised that he would never allow insects into her room. The princess assured the emperor that all was well and suggested they go to dinner. Joseph, thinking that his daughter wanted to spend time together, immediately calmed down and agreed. He also told her that they had prepared a special dish for them. As it turned out, today was a special day, namely the anniversary. It seemed to the girl that on such an occasion, the servants had prepared a lot of sweets. And she was really right, because when she saw the table, it was decorated really posh, and there were a lot of her favorite sweets and dishes. They began to eat, and Joseph was talking to his daughter while the girl tried to convince her toy that she should not eat ordinary food because he might get sick. But the duck liked the potatoes, so the girl decided to feed him all the potatoes that the emperor offered her. The emperor looked at his daughter, who was enjoying the food with peace, because at such moments the girl resembled her mother. The girl also liked to enjoy the food under the stars, but the sudden talk about her mother empress very surprised the protagonist, because the girl thought she was dead. But as it turned out, the woman was alive, but Joseph could not tell Darjeeling about it. The assumption of her death occurred to the protagonist when she stopped seeing the empress and her servants, but when she heard that she was alive, she assumed that the woman lived outside the palace, though it seemed odd that her mother had never visited her, and Darjeelina had a suspicion that her mother might have simply run away. The emperor promised that they could meet soon, as it had been 3 years since her birth. Of course, the protagonist was curious to know what had happened to the empress, but her life did not depend on this woman, so she had nothing to worry about. A couple of days later, Darjeelina was lying on her bed, talking about how bored she was, because in her past life she had a lot of work, but now she just had to lie there. She had also heard from the servants that Joseph had spent a huge amount of money to install insect extermination machines throughout the empire. But suddenly, her duck brought her a bell. The girl thought it was rather nice of him and decided to use it. Apparently, the duck knew from the beginning that when she rang the bell, the servants would come. As soon as she rang the bell, the servants immediately noticed that the princess did not look very well and suspected that she had not slept well because of her dreams. But they decided to please the princess with the news of the arrival of the countess, who will bring with her many toys from trees growing in the north. Although this news should have made her happy, the thought of those loud children made her even more worried. As soon as everyone was gathered, the children immediately started telling Darjeelina about something, and Carlyle, who had heard that the princess was not feeling well, tried to find out about her condition. She had to convince the boy that she was fine, and also make excuses for her father, who had installed a bunch of systems to exterminate mosquitoes. But it was a rational enough decision, because mosquitoes were vectors of disease, and once they were gone, people were less likely to suffer from stomach aches. Darjeelina suspected that these machines improved the quality of the water. But suddenly Martha and her brother asked that the princess talk to more than just their older brother and play with them. But suddenly they got distracted by noticing the princess's little duckling, so they started playing with it, leaving the girl alone for a while at least. But she was worried that they might discover its laser shooting ability. But suddenly she heard a strange sound outside, shouting from far away, so the children assumed that there might be a festival going on at that time. But in that case, the princess should know about it, as she was a member of the imperial family. But she was not told about the festival. As it turned out, at that time the great commander was riding through the square on his horse, and everyone was congratulating him on his victory. Darjeelina immediately went to her father and sat in front of the aristocrats in the throne room. At that moment, the knight entered the room, after which he greeted them. The general told them that she had been able to quell the rebellion by order of the Lord, and Joseph said that he had always believed in the girl's success. Then he wanted to talk to the general to discuss important matters, and asked him to clear this room of strangers. This news surprised the princess, for it seemed to her that there were no more unoccupied kingdoms left on the continent, so she could not understand where the rebellion was. As soon as all the aristocrats dispersed, then the general immediately came up to embrace Joseph and the little girl. The protagonist still did not understand what was happening, but then the girl finally took off her protective helmet and stroked her daughter's head, realizing that she had most likely frightened her with her sudden visit. Seeing Hecate, the main character, was very surprised, because originally she and Joseph were bitter enemies, but in the end, somehow married. Then the mother apologized to her daughter and told her that the girl was born on the battlefield, and for the sake of her salvation, immediately after her birth, she was sent to the imperial palace for safety. The protagonist knew how talented a general Hecate was, and realized that if it took 3 years to fight under her leadership, the war was likely to be a large-scale war. But the empire was fairly quiet, most likely because of the people's belief in their incredible military might. But still, the princess was very confused by everything that was going on and suspected that they were now writing a completely different history of their empire. Hecate also understood how hard it was for her husband, but he was ready to bear it all knowing that his beloved would return to him. Looking at their amorous looks, the main character had a hard time accepting the realization that they were a married couple. Joseph did not neglect Lilith, the Empress's faithful assistant, and asked her to continue to take care of the woman, but her name excited Darjeelina, for it was the name of the divine serpent. When she looked at the girl, she realized that she was the same snake, the only creature that had left the earth created by God of its own free will. It had disappeared so long ago that everyone thought it was dead, but it was alive and still looked the same. After a little more talking, the Empress gave the princess to the maids and asked them to take her to a room for her to rest. Darjeelina didn't argue, but she was still confused about Lilith, for a snake never lends a helping hand without wanting something in return, so she needed to find out why she was here before the disaster began. When Darjeelina went on, her maid complained that she was too bored, so together they decided to reschedule her classes. But first, the girl needed to dress up. The princess realized that at least doing something useful was much better than just lying on the bed. The maids were crazy about the princess, who looked simply gorgeous in her new outfit for the class. Her lesson was on the history of military science. When she heard the name, she realized that she was easy enough to cope with this subject, and she would be able to show herself and her intelligence. She also wanted to take Bobby with her, but she warned the duck that where they were going, he wouldn't be allowed to use the laser. Bobby happily agreed, and they ended up going together. When they got to the office, the princess saw a boy she knew well, Sasha, and another older lady who was the princess's history teacher. Her name was Elila, and she was an advisor to the past empress. Seeing her, the protagonist was shocked because she thought that the woman had retired long ago after her death, but it was not so. Sasha greeted the princess, explaining that he would also be helping her with her classes. Looking at the boy, the heroine couldn't understand what he was doing here and suspected that he was a teacher's assistant at such a young age. She didn't know what Sasha could teach her because he was still young and the protagonist had lived a lifetime. Then she asked her teacher to start, and so they began their lessons. But Darjeelina's teacher asked the emperor and empress to leave, as the princess would not be able to concentrate on the lessons and would be distracted by her parents, and the teacher wanted to give the princess the best education as the future ruler of the empire. The emperor and empress felt very depressed, but they left, and Darjeelina was convinced that she had chosen the right counselor, because even after years, she was insanely smart and judicious as before. Darjeelina, who had lived many lives, knew that the legend had been embellished with different details with each generation, and the real story had been lost. But Sasha thought that the legend of the founding of the empire must be very interesting. And the protagonist thought that perhaps his interest was due to his young age. The teacher began her story by saying that once the first humans planted seeds in a desert land. The seeds sprouted and grew into vast forests and endless flowering fields. Mankind used the benefits of nature to develop civilization, and the bravest of the human race took the place of the leader. What is unusual is that the leader was born from an egg, and after using his own ribs, he created a new human race. The newly created humans were a reasonable race that was able to establish the Great Kingdom. Sasha listened to the story carefully, but noticed that each region of their empire had its own version of the story. And then the teacher asked to tell another version. Sasha began his story with already forgotten, more ancient times. A long time ago, the first creation of this world was boundless black matter. This is what is now called space. The cosmos was created by God. Also, he created a giant who ruled the universe. In time, nature flourished and many different creatures inhabited the earth. Then mankind was born, but the people who settled on earth were not the first people God had created. The new race came together as a group and soon formed their kingdom. Humans were loved by God and therefore were able to achieve unprecedented heights. The leader betrayed his legacy to his children and they to the next generation. And then the giant became only a slight memory to the humans, and God completely forgot about his existence. The princess liked this story, for it was different from what she had heard for the past few centuries, for the legend of the founding had been passed down by word of mouth, and with each generation, new details had been added to it. Although, of course, the main part of the text had been retained. The teacher also liked the story told by Sasha, although in her opinion, it was more like a fairy tale. It seemed that Sasha had read this story in a book in their residence, and even the teacher wanted to visit the ducal family of Vladimir in order to familiarize herself with this edition. Also, the teacher wanted to move on to the history of the empire. The princess already guessed that she was about to talk about the founder of the kingdom and how she had put down a rebellion in a past life. Eventually, the lesson ended, and she discussed it with her assistant, Sasha, who was amazed by the princess's answers to all of the marquise's questions. But the girl herself was not surprised at all, although she was worried that Sasha was beginning to guess that she had gone through all of this on her own. During her vacation, Darjeelina also decided to visit the count's children. The twins immediately began asking the princess to play with them, but Carlyle greeted the princess discreetly and tried to find out how her class went. As it turned out, the maids and the empress had specially prepared a treasure hunting game for the protagonist and her friends. Then the joyful little children began to think about how interesting it was to search for treasures, and then immediately began to scatter to the search. The map also went to the main character. Sasha thought that this game was quite interesting, but the girl herself did not like it. The maids took the children to the labyrinth and offered to explore it. They explained that the places with hidden treasures were located where there were red marks on the map. The maids also told them that there were small gifts all over the map, but in the center was the best of them, which was the only one of its kind. In addition, the one who reaches the center of the maze first will get the most delicious treat. In the end, the children divided. The main character went according to the direction of the map. The maze the girl caught a glimpse of back in her past life, but it had changed a bit in recent times. Finally, the girl noticed a red flag indicating the presence of the treasure, and when she dug it out, she saw a small chest. When she opened it, she saw a doll, which surprised her very much, because for a special gift, the quality of the doll was not so good. It looked worse than her duckling, but for some reason this doll seemed insanely familiar to the girl, as if she had seen it before. It was like the doll she had once given to Hecate. Suddenly, the memories made her feel a pinch in her chest, and then the spirit that had taken away her happiness appeared in front of her. He appeared before the protagonist, in a glowing light to inform her that the girl had finally found one of the answers to his question, and praised her. Then the protagonist noticed that she was crying for some reason, and didn't understand why. At one point, the protagonist began to remember everyone who had appeared and disappeared in the turbulent flow of time and her life. And for the first time in her life, she missed them all. The disappearing spirit explained to the girl that her newfound friends would always be with her. The princess was also approached by Carlyle, who showed her a treasure he had found on his own. It was a small toy in the form of a horse, which he wanted to give to the princess. She was a little confused because Carlyle wanted to give her this animal, because he thought that she liked wooden horses. Before the protagonist could think about it, Sasha appeared in front of her. The princess was surprised that he did not leave with the children. The boy also expressed his assumption that the found doll was handmade by the empress. And even though it was crude, it was obvious that a soul had been put into it. So most likely it was a doll made especially for a girl. Sasha wondered how the princess felt when she had what she wanted most of all. The main character didn't understand what she was talking about, because she wanted to die most of all. But suddenly Lilith came up to her and bent down to greet Her Highness the Princess. The girl was happy that she had finally found her. After that, Lilith and Sasha looked at each other strangely, greeting each other, and Sasha decided to leave the princess to go home. He ended up saying goodbye and leaving, and the protagonist was glad to have one less person around her now. But suddenly, Lilith crouched down on the girl's lap and noticed that the princess's face looked tearful, but she embarrassingly denied that she had cried at all. In the end, the princess asked why Lilith was looking at Duke Vladimir's son so strangely. As it turned out, for some reason the girl was angry when she saw the color red. Darjeelina did not argue, although she was more and more surprised at how the snake had managed to survive all this time. Darjeelina also asked Lilith to behave more carefully next time, because her ambiguous behavior could put the Emperors in an uncomfortable position. Lilith realized that the girl was just worried about her parents, although the protagonist tried to argue it. Also, Lilith reminded the princess that she had a lesson to teach now. As it turned out, it was Lilith who would be her teacher in military history. The protagonist couldn't believe it, but she didn't argue. Lilith decided to focus specifically on military theory for starters, since the girl was too young. After that, they would move on to something more practical. For some reason, Lilith was sure that the princess already knew about the military forces, so she decided to tell her about the other factions. The Vladimir family gets a lot of support from the aristocrats and is the most powerful family in their empire. There was also a family that Carlyle belonged to who came to the princess to play. This family had the same power as Duke Vladimir, and they also had the best troops in the empire. But compared to the Vladimirs, they didn't have as much support among the aristocrats because of their past, as their ancestors ruled the kingdom on the frontier. It was then that the protagonist realized that Carlyle was a royal descendant, and his family came from the kingdom she had taken over with her own hands. Apparently, that was why he acted more mature than children his own age, though she still couldn't understand why the Duke's son was living with the Countess's children. Lilith explained that the Bergamot family was the last to join the empire, so unlike Vladimir, they had not received proper support. That was why the assassination had happened a few years ago. That was when General Hecate arrived to protect the family, along with Lilith. Lilith explained to the general that they needed to leave, but the woman could not leave the child alone. She knew that the Countess had no children, so she decided to give the boy to her care. Everyone else accepted her orders. In the end, the only survivor of the family was the young Duke of Bergamot. Hecate wanted to give the boy a chance to grow strong and stand on his own 2 feet so that he could take the Duke's place, as was his birthright. But it seemed to the protagonist that it was the responsibility of his relatives to take care of the parentless boy. It seemed to the protagonist that Carlyle must have at least some very distant relatives. But as it turned out, most of the young lord's family had died a few years before the attack or had been exiled to the island. The princess guessed that if that was the case, since the boy was under the protection of the Countess by order of the Empress, then the imperial family must have appointed trusted people to oversee the household of the 7 Bergamots. Darjeelina had originally suspected that there must have been some reason why the boy was with the Countess's children, but it turned out to be more complicated than that. Darjeelina was sorry that this young child had suffered so much grief. Eventually, the class was coming to an end, but Lilith remembered that their princess was hated by a very interesting person, and Lilith decided to tell the girl in confidence. Then she whispered in her ear that she was hated by the first creature that God created, but the protagonist calmly explained that the first creature was her. Lilith only laughed and reminded the protagonist how dangerous it was to reveal her true identity. But the girl didn't see it as a problem, since Lilith had initially recognized her, though it bothered her how she could do it, since Lilith didn't have her former powers. As it turned out, Lilith recognized the girl because of her unique eyes, for in this world, she was the only one who possessed ravishing violet eyes like gems. But Lilith wondered how the protagonist could recognize her. But it wasn't hard, for she still had the same face, the same name. So next time, the protagonist advised her to think of something new. Suddenly, the protagonist remembered the legend that Sasha had told her. She also remembered the reason why she was always loved by the second kind of people. The reason was that she was the first creature. She was most likely the giant from the legend that Sasha had told them about. She tried not to think about it, because the stories of an ordinary person could not be believed. Besides, she had already lived many lives, and no one had ever built obstacles for her. In the end, everything just got mixed up in the girl's head. She tried to figure out who really hated her, and who Lilith was hinting at, but she couldn't think of anything, because she thought she was completely blameless. This reaction of the princess only amused Lilith, and then the angry girl decided to finish the lesson. But as it turned out, Lilith was planning to take the princess to the training room, and she was surprised. Then they came to the training room, and there was already Hecate, who was practicing with a sword. But when she saw her daughter, she immediately put all other things aside and joyfully went to the girl to hug and greet her. Her mother really missed her daughter very much, and then Darjeelina made sure that Hecate also went crazy and became insanely similar to Joseph, and this resemblance even she was a little frightened. Then the Empress told that those treasures, which were hidden in the labyrinth, were made by her own hands on the battlefield, and she worked on them every night, thinking of her child. For some reason unknown to the protagonist, something in the girl's heart clenched and pricked again. It was very unpleasant, because such feelings had never occurred before. But still she thanked her mother, explaining that these treasures were very nice. As it turned out a little later, Lilith had brought the princess here because she saw how much the Empress missed her. So the joyful woman decided to show her daughter around and just spend some time talking with her. But before doing so, she took her sword and addressed the rest of the knights, explaining that today their only princess of the empire had decided to take a look at the skills of their army. Usually sparring was demonstrated for this purpose, but there was a risk that the young princess might get hurt. So all the knights had to sing the military hymn that had united them for the past 3 years. Then, all the knights as one began to sing the hymn, urging the warriors to raise their swords and follow their duty to destroy their enemies. While all the knights sang, their general and empress just listened silently to this tune, and at this moment looked incredibly majestic, so much so that even the protagonist couldn't help but recognize it. After the hymn was over, the girl sat down on a bench to watch her parent and sent Lilith away. But watching the army, she realized that even after 3 years of continuous warfare, the men lacked experience, which made her a little sad. But suddenly she noticed one of the statues. And as she got closer, she noticed that this statue looked just like the protagonist herself in her former days. So he had no doubt that it was her. He explained that it was the Vladimir family that had given this statue to the imperial family, and the emperor had ordered it especially for the training field. But this was only one of the statues they made. Also, Sasha wondered why the princess could not take her eyes off the statue, but she calmly explained that for some reason, this statue reminded her of someone. The girl didn't understand how the statue could remind her of someone she knew, and Sasha explained that this statue implied a girl who prayed for this world. And usually the sculptor used facial features that were pleasing to most people. But Darjeelina already knew about these subtleties of art. Later, the maids came to pick her up and take her to the palace. And then, walking with them down the corridors, Darjeelina realized how strange her day had been. And she really needed a good rest after dinner. But suddenly, her father ran into her, who was in a great hurry to get somewhere. He immediately excused himself and picked his daughter up on his arm and began to look her over to make sure she was okay. He also asked that the maids leave, for they were no longer needed. The girls immediately bowed and left. When the girl again convinced her father that she was fine, he thought that his daughter was insanely strong, and he wondered who she had taken after, her mother or her father. But looking at the emperor's overly satisfied face, Darjeelina realized that most likely it was these 2 young men who were like her former rebirth. The father also decided to take the child to the dining hall, for she had been on the training field and was probably tired. And when the father was in a hurry, he wanted to take Darjeelina to dinner. But the girl explained to the father that he could put her down, and she did not have to be carried in his arms all the time. She could get there on her own. But he wanted to take her to the hall, and did so only of his own accord. The main character thought that her day was as ordinary as any other day, although the treasure hunt was the most memorable part of the day, because it was a rather unique experience for her. Then Daddy asked if the girl had found the gift her mother had prepared, for the Empress had told him how long she had been working on it. He also asked his daughter to treasure the treasure, but she only grudgingly thought that she would have treasured the doll even without asking for it. But she was again disturbed by a strange feeling that enveloped her body, as if her heart were throbbing strongly. And then looking at Joseph, she tried to understand if she could find the answer to the spirit's question, thanks to this man and Hecate. Although the realization of this annoyed her greatly. The next day, the protagonist again went with the maid to the room where the children were waiting for her. But to her surprise, when she arrived, she did not see their usual games and did not hear any noise, which surprised her very much. But suddenly the children ran up to her and quickly put a hoop on her, so that she was now another animal, just like them. Bariah and Carlisle decided to give her a surprise and play animals with her. But this surprise really surprised the main character. But suddenly, the little boy noticed that Bobby the duck had no headband, which made him very sad. Darjalina wanted to give the duck his headband, but that made the boy even more upset. And then the princess suggested to make Bobby just a regular duck. They ended up assigning roles. The boy was the rabbit, Carlisle was the wolf, and the princess was the raccoon. Then Barry asked her to put on a headband. As it turned out, Martha was in the library at the time, and the emperor had allowed her to come there to read a little. This surprised the princess, for she had not thought Martha a very bright child before. After that, she was asked to play the game, and finally she agreed. But she kept waiting for the children to get tired. And after a while, they really fell asleep. Then the main character decided to leave the children to sleep and asked the maid to wake them up before it got dark so that they could get home safely. At the same time, the protagonist wanted to go back to her room, but she was passing by the library and stopped to think about going inside to check on Martha. The maid was very surprised, but agreed and opened the door. The princess was uneasy because she had not seen the noisy girl for a day, so she thought that Martha might be up to something. But when she entered the room, she immediately sensed an evil presence, and she now felt a clear thunderstorm, as if many bad thoughts had come together, so she could not understand what was going on. But to her surprise, when she came out, she found that all the bad thoughts were coming from a small child reading a book. Despite the fact that she looked innocent from her and came off obviously bad energy, which very confused the princess, because the surrounding energy was dark thoughts that can be found only in the wasteland, and the protagonist did not like the fact that lately so many strange things are happening to her. So she even said it seemed that she was going crazy. When she looked at Martha again, the cloud had disappeared, and everything looked as usual. So the protagonist couldn't believe her eyes, and decided to ask the girl if she had seen anything strange. Martha didn't notice anything, and she had been reading all day, and looking at the girl, the protagonist made sure that she wasn't seized by dark thoughts. Then Martha showed the book she had been reading all day. The book was called Military Tactics, and it was clearly not meant for a child of that age. It had records of tactics and strategies used by the world's greatest conquerors, and it was strange that such a book could be soaked in darkness. The protagonist also tried to find out the reason for choosing this particular book, but March just liked its cover. Darjalina knew that cursed objects always bewitched people, but the girl was able to explain why she took this particular book. And if she was bewitched, she wouldn't be able to explain the reason. Then she tried to find out what the book was about, but smiling awkwardly, the girl explained that she didn't know anything at all. Then the main character calmed down, realizing that everything was all right, and Martha was in no danger. Then they heard the voice of Barry, who was looking for them. Then joyful Martha decided to return to her brothers, and the protagonist told the maid that she also wanted to read the book. When they met the children, Barry did not bother to cry because he woke up and did not find the princess next to him, and because of that, he was very much afraid. He was wondering why the girl ran away and left him alone with Carlisle. It seemed to him that the protagonist hated them. The princess was very embarrassed to hear this, but she had to convince the boy that everything was all right. The maid tried to distract the children and explained that they could prepare another game for them, which they would also enjoy. Marty and Barry really liked this idea, and so Barry immediately calmed down. Then the maids decided that they would all make cookies together and told them that first they had to knead the dough, cut it, and then put it in the oven. But the main character didn't know how much of a good idea it was to make cookies with these kids, because it was unlikely that they would be edible. After that, they started playing with the dough, but they still intended to make the most delicious cookies. Although Carlisle had explained to the children that they had to make cookies specifically, and they could bake whatever they wanted. That's when Darjeelina realized that the maids, in all likelihood, wanted to give them fine motor exercises that help the emotional development of children. But she felt a little nauseous just at the thought of having to eat it later, especially since she thought it was rude to use Play-Doh, since it was made of wheat, which was the main food source of the population of their empire. Carlyle was not averse to molding, and he tried to mold the face of the princess. Even though there was no obvious resemblance, Darjeelina still praised the boy, considering him very talented. In the end, when it was all finished, they had a whole tray of dough figurines. The maid prepared an oven for the children, and they put the dough inside and moved on to the next game. The maid prepared a box and asked the children to put their hands in it and try to guess what was inside the box, but they were not allowed to pull out the contents. The first one to guess would get a watermelon cake. The first would be Barry, but as soon as he tried to touch the contents of the box, he was immediately scared that there was some kind of monster inside. The next was Carlyle, but he was also somehow very scared. Then it was the turn of the main character, but she was warned that she should be as careful as possible because the contents were very dangerous. When the girl began to touch what was inside, she felt that the creature had quite soft fur, and it was something quite large, like a stuffed animal. But as it seemed at that time, Barry got into the box from the other side, and that's why the main character was touching him by his hair. And then he sneezed, and all the slime was on the main character's hand. Barry got out of the box and said that he had won on purpose for the princess, so that she wouldn't have to guess who was in the dangerous box. Just by the time they were done with the games, all their cookies were ready. It was obvious that the maids had prepared a completely different batch, and this reassured the girl, for she would certainly not die if she did eat them. The children immediately happily pounced on the cookies, and the maids calmly asked the children to wash their hands before they started eating, and asked them to come back with the princess and her older brother so they could eat together. After that, the children started fighting and looking for someone to blame for who ran to the cookies first, and then the disgruntled girl realized that Barry and Martha didn't even need a special reason to fight once again. But in order to reconcile them, Carlyle came to the rescue again and asked the younger ones to behave better and not make the princess wait so long for them. The princess came to the maids, and it was immediately obvious to her that the cookies looked different, and she wondered how the others didn't notice the change. But it was even better, and she didn't want to say anything. She picked one of the cookies and asked that it be wrapped and taken to her room so she could eat in peace. She also remembered about the riddle with the box and that they were supposed to get watermelon cake as a reward. The main character explained that Barry had defeated the monsters in the box, so no one had a chance to guess. So she wanted everyone to get a piece of watermelon cake. Eventually, the dessert was ready and looked really beautiful. It was shared among all the children, and they were very happy about the dessert and also very grateful for the kindness of their princess.